Good evening and welcome to Bent TV. First up tonight, we meet Asiel Adan Sanchez, who recently spoke at the Orlando memorial service held at Federation Square. We then meet Imam Nur Warsame, who tells us of the special problems and issues that Islamic LGBTI youth face. And then to finish tonight, we meet Starlady, who has recently returned from Central Australia, and of the projects that she is now involved with in Melbourne.
Welcome to Bent TV. I'm Andy McNamara, and tonight I'm speaking to Asiel Adan Sanchez. Welcome.
Thank you.
You are a Mexican national originally studying medicine in Australia and now an Australian.
That's right.
Cool.
Fully fledged Australian.
Yeah. And we were fortunate to see you at Fed Square recently at the Orlando Memorial, speaking, I guess, not directly, but on behalf of non-white queer people.
Yeah, well, the invitation kind of came through, and originally it was kind of another speaker that had been invited, but he was kind enough to say, I'm not from, a Latinx background. You might talk to Asiel and, they might be interested. And I initially thought it was going to be a relatively small thing. I thought it was going to be like 10 people in the corner of Fed Square, and that's it. But then I showed up, and there was this huge crowd, and I walked into the speaker's tent, and there was, Bill Shorten and a band, and the U.S. consulate, and I thought, oh gosh, I'm about to push your countries under the bus, and here we go. So it was quite an exciting opportunity and quite a unique experience, I suppose. Yeah.
And you had some strong opinions, and a lot of the audience were very excited and impressed by that. And we're going to explore a few of those thoughts, I think. Let's start with the phrase LGBTIQ, which to most of us is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer. What does it mean to you?
Well, to me, it means such a kind of diverse community, and I don't think there's any one acronym that we can, fit everyone into. So it just keeps expanding and expanding, every 6 months by the looks of it. But at the same time, it comes from a very specific kind of background, and a lot of the terms come from kind of either American or European thought. So, for example, in Mexico, our indigenous communities have muxes, which I guess you would consider as trans, I suppose. But in reality, they're seen as their own specific gender, and it's a very culturally specific gender. And they're valued members of the community. Our incidence of gender dysphoria is very low in those communities because they're so reverenced and accepted and loved. And similarly, in Australia, sister boys and sister girls and brother boys.
Yes.
Are part of the indigenous community, and we have Hitcheras and Indias and Fafafinis and so on. So a lot of those kind of trans and gender diverse terms don't encompass that cultural diversity, I suppose. So I feel like it's quite specific.
Right. So what you're saying is there's a sort of a de facto racism, I guess, within the queer community because it's all focused on the Western white model, but is there direct racism also within the queer community? I
feel there is quite a lot of both direct and indirect. As you mentioned, we kind of just saw that in the terminology that we use to describe ourselves. But I mean, if you go on a lot of the kind of the dating sites, and particularly within the gay community, there's the racism that's just blatant. It's not indirect, it's not hidden, it's just there in your face. And we have to work to kind of challenge against that. And it takes that extra bit of effort to kind of have that conversation with people and say, is this space inclusive? And when you go to kind of gay spaces and you feel a bit uncomfortable, you start to wonder, why? And it's because you see yourself surrounded by white people, and it can be quite confronting, I suppose.
Asiel, how do you identify?
So I identify as non-binary in terms of gender. In terms of sexuality, I guess somewhere in between gay and pan. But it's I guess a new space for me because Latin America comes from such a strict machismo, very gendered, very masculine kind of place, and I just found myself always ostracized by it. So to me, for example, the first time that I saw kind of a Frida Kahlo painting, and I saw the way she played with gender, and I saw a lot of her strength reflecting in her femininity, and I thought that speaks to me more than any of the masculinity that I've seen throughout my life. So I realized that a lot of my experience came from kind of this other space that wasn't masculine. And that's where it all kind of came from. Yeah.
It sounds like you've been on a journey and you're possibly still on it.
Yeah, definitely, by the sense of it. And I feel for queer people of color, often the journey is just not coming to terms with their gender or sexuality or identity. It's also coming to terms with their cultural heritage and reconciling those two. So we kind of have to come out twice almost. Yeah.
And I guess for many non-white cultures, the coming out is a lot more difficult too, because the cultures are often a lot more conservative.
Yeah, that's right. It might not necessarily be that they're conservative per se, but that we think of gender and sexuality in a different cultural paradigm. So, for example, if I came out to my extended family in Mexico, they wouldn't know quite what to do with the gender or sexuality, just because the way that we framed it has been in this very ethnocentric Anglo kind of discourse. So a lot of the time it is about finding how to navigate those spaces, and a lot of the time we're not given the space to come out and have those conversations. I mean, in my time here in Australia, I've only met a handful of other, gay Mexicans who have been here, and a handful of other queer Mexicans. And it's very much the same for other queer people of color that I've met around. The spaces to have those conversations are just not there. Do
we need safe spaces for non-white queer people?
I think we do. And a lot of the time, I guess, when these conversations kind of come up in the mainstream gay community, it's kind of seen as a non-issue, or it's seen as an issue that doesn't apply to them. Therefore, it's not, a gay thing. It's a something else thing. So having those specific spaces to come on and talk specifically very much about your culture and how you navigate it, and what are your role models, what inspired you, how you told your family, how you didn't tell your family, all those conversations often don't happen within those gay spaces and are often not given the chance to happen in those spaces. So in my experience, we do need to have specific things, I guess, for queer people of color to come together and really talk to each other, find a way of mediating their culture and their gender, sexuality, whatever it may be.
Diversity within diversity, I guess, is one of the things. What are your thoughts on that, and how can you celebrate it? Definitely.
I mean, the LGBTIQ community is already such a diverse kind of platform in itself. Specifically, when we're thinking about like gender, there's so many ways you could express your gender. But to have that expanded upon and to include cultures and backgrounds that are not specifically white, that are not always kind of the same representations over and over and over and over, and the same narratives over and over and over and over, is extremely important. So in my own experience, I've never seen broader cultures kind of acknowledged in LGBTIQ spaces. So expanding that diversity within diversity is very important.
Awesome. I totally agree. You've been watching Bent TV. Our guest has been Asiel Adan Sanchez. Thanks so much. See you soon.
Good evening, my name's Steve Pereira. Welcome to Bent TV. Tonight we're talking to Nur Warsame, Australia's first and at this point only gay imam. Nur, welcome to Bent TV.
Thank you.
Nur, in the past year you've had a very public coming out. You've been on national TV, on national press, and national media. Why this public outing? Why this outing in such a public way?
I decided in the last year, particularly this year, to speak to the media because, this has been a personal struggle for me. So I just wanted to shed light on it on a national level and put a human face to the problems that I'm talking about.
And what specifically are the problems you're talking about?
Homophobia, Islamophobia, this violent reaction to being different.
If you look at Islamophobia, the combination of Islam and homosexuality, sexuality on basic research, it's not very positive. The number of Islamic countries that still carry the death penalty is about 7. The number of deaths to homosexuals, most recently the person in Syria being thrown over the rooftop, the Orlando killing, which was in some ways a murder done for the Islamic State by somebody who's conflicted about his sexuality. There seems to be an urgent need to look at moderate Islam and homosexuality. Is that part of the reason for your coming out?
The issues that I'm addressing when it comes to homosexuality in the Muslim community has existed and does still exist in many faiths, many organized religions. But I am trying to focus and address my community from an angle that is compassionate, that is accepting, because this is what all religions essentially were promoting. But we have somehow constructed these different ideologies that are killing our youth. So Orlando and this ISIS throwing people off roofs and things like that are very, very contradictory to the basic teachings of my religion, Islam.
The real danger is now we already, thanks to all of the rhetoric around, we've conflated Islam with violence, and now we're conflating Islam with homophobia. How do we counteract that? How do we address that?
We need to have platforms that are safe for these discussions to happen. And in order for that to happen, what is needed is legislation, government legislation, to prevent discrimination. What is needed is a safe transition for people who are in environments of conflict and have no resources available to them. So obviously funding is needed for mental health, for affordable housing, for unemployment, specifically youth unemployment, because you know, our youth are our leaders of thought in the future, and when you kill their confidence based on some outdated interpretations in the name of God, you know, the reaction can be very ugly.
But even now, for instance, in response to your coming out, Kaiser Tarat from this Australian Federation of Islamic Council is still insisting that the Quran is against, and Islam, formally and traditionally, is against homosexuals and will not condone any sort of homosexual activity. Faced with that message, how do young Muslims today negotiate that space between the spirituality and the sexuality?
Well, that's why I started the group called Marhaba, which is a social support group that helps youth in reconciling or trying to reconcile their faith and their sexuality. You know, the reference that you have made of the imams, this is a clear example and proof of the experience that I have had and the knowledge that I have of my community, that we have an issue when it comes to leadership, faith leadership. And when I started the group, I had an issue with youth, specifically either leading a double life, getting married and falling into those pressures, which happened to me, or rejecting their faith, you know, saying, look, I've had enough. And so I had a problem with that, because to me, both issues are personal, and you know, my identity and my religion, they're very important to me. So to be in an environment that you're told, choose one or the other, I had an issue with that.
So how did you resolve that issue though?
We facilitated a group called Marhaba, and we try to re-educate the youth and manage the trauma that, because you're talking about heavy trauma. So, and for the general public, you know, we need to support these types of organizations that are trying to heal the trauma that people have gone through. And my job as an imam is I try to give them an alternative to the theology that has been encoded in it.
But if that alternative is not accepted by the mainstream, are you then not just forming a splinter group away from traditional Islam? And is that addressing the issue?
When I say I'm providing an alternative, I mean you always have opposition when you are in mainstream Islam even. And I'm not starting something new. All I'm doing is I'm addressing certain vacuums that exist in my community, and religion is used to make those vacuums happen. So, and I'm saying that that's not the case, and I use my theological backing to shed light on that.
Thank you for watching. I'm Steve Pereira, and you've been with myself and Nur Warsame, Australia's first gay imam. Thank you so much for watching.
Welcome to Bent TV. I am Andy McNamara, and today I am joined by Starlady. Welcome, Starlady.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I want to talk about your history and some of the great work you've done. Maybe we can sort of start at the very beginning from your work life.
Oh, well, I've been an activist for over 20 years.
Lordy.
Yes, and some of that's been within queer and LGBTIQ rights, animal rights, environmental rights, refugee and asylum seeker issues.
Yes.
I've come from a perspective of, human and environmental rights.
You spread yourself
social
around.
Justice, yes.
Can you tell us about your work in the Northern Territory?
I've just returned to Melbourne after living in Alice Springs for 7 years, where I was working in remote Aboriginal communities on doing hairdressing and fashion. It's sort of youth-based social change community development model.
And I guess the thinking of this is, if you, particularly the queer kids, if you confront them directly, they're going to be terrified and run away. But if you do something that's fun, they can share things and be proud of what they're doing.
Yeah, I didn't necessarily, go to the Central Desert to work with LGBTIQ youth or sister girl or brother boys. I went there to work with Indigenous youth and Indigenous communities. I wanted to, be in a position where I could learn about culture, about other ways of living, and about, about Australian, history. And also, I've had a long history of going out and working with Indigenous communities, and it was a place where I felt the most loved and supported. And so it was a place where I felt like I could, shine and, develop my practice and professional career. And
it's great to hear that you were so accepted in some communities that are quite conservative. How did that come about? What's your secret?
Okay, well, I think in the Northern Territory and within Indigenous culture, authenticity is a highly valued way of being. Mm-hmm. People read you there, and they read you if you're being true and you're being real, and all they really want to know is that if you've got a good heart. Right. And if they can see that, then you're accepted. And I think from seeing, maybe people had ideas that weren't most positive around LGBTIQ identities and culture, because it's different within, different cultures.
True.
But people could see that I was a genuine person, and I think that really helped people, begin to be open to LGBTIQ community.
You have moved back to Melbourne now.
Yes.
What work? Let's start with your paid work. What work are you doing now?
I work for the Zobel Gender Collective, which is a transgender and gender diverse youth advocacy role.
Doing,
I work with mainstream and LGBTI human and health services to educate around transgender identities and rights.
Okay, so both.
So it's like an educational role to be able to help people working with transgender and gender diverse youth.
So you're both working with the transgender youth, but also with the general communities or service providers.
Yeah, mostly with service providers, and obviously linking them in with transgender youth and trans and gender diverse youth-led organisations.
For trans people, medical and health service providers, I suspect, know less than nothing about trans people and what they need. What's it like for a trans person trying to find medical and health support?
I mean, I do think there are a few good health practitioners out there, but I think the general standard for transgender and gender diverse people accessing mental health care, or people who may need to be psychologically evaluated in Australia to be able to medically affirm their gender, is appalling. People are highly pathologised, where mental health professionals are looking at transgender and gender diverse identities as there's something inherently wrong with our identities. And I think also there's an incredible amount of power that those mental health professionals have, because you need to go and get approved to medically affirm your gender. Like, you've got to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And are you actually going to feel, if you're getting an incredibly poor service and being discriminated or stigmatised within that space, are you going to feel empowered to complain? And so people aren't. And so we need to have massive health reforms around these issues. But I also think that we need to be doing a lot of work within the trans and gender diverse community around rights-based literacy. Like, there are pathways that we can use to complain. And if we have the capacity to complain, then we should investigate those pathways, including, the Australian Human Rights Commission, the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. But we also have medical bodies like APRA, and we also have the Mental Health Complaints Commissioner and the Health Services Complaints Commission. And we need to begin relationships with these organisations and use these pathways. And we need to be educating service providers to support us to complain.
As a young person way out in the suburbs who feels they're trans, they're going to look at their local doctor and think he or she just knows nothing, cannot guide me in any way that is going to be real or authentic, and not know where to go. Where can people start?
I mean, we do have there are a few services, like obviously we have community-based service like VAX Equinox Clinic, and we also have the Monash Gender Dysphoria Clinic, and then we have private clinics like Northside and the Paran Market Clinic. But we also need to be seeing the government funding support, like training, training for GPs, for mental health practitioners. We need to see within our medical like universities and education systems, we need to be seeing transgender and gender diverse content that is implemented in part of that, because at the moment it might be you might have half a day, if that, of a 4-year degree or longer. And until we start implementing these health modules, transgender and gender diverse health modules, how do we educate our health professionals? One last thing before we go, I would like to see, we've seen things like the Safe Schools Coalition protests, we've seen marriage equality protests. I think we need to see some direct action in regards to transgender and gender diverse health and health outcomes, and we need to come together as a community with our cisgender allies to stand up for our health rights.
Starlady, thanks so much for being with us tonight. I'm Andy McNamara, you're watching Bent TV.